That was our chair, by the way. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of the Great Problems, Great Minds seminar series hosted by the Department of Social Sciences. My name is Yuri Mansouri. In case you don't know me, I am an associate professor of social sciences for Illinois Tech. I want to first thank Professor Hao Huang here, who is the faculty in charge of organizing the Great Minds seminar series. And of course, I want to thank Professor Jeff Terry, who is the chair of the Department of Social Sciences, for his support of the seminar. It's a great pleasure to introduce you to our senior colleague and my mentor, really, Professor Kieran Donaghy of Cornell University. Professor Donaghy is currently Professor Emeritus at Cornell University. He has a long and distinguished career as a faculty administrator as well, serving as the chair of the City and Regional Planning Department, between 2008 and 2016. He was also for many years the director of our graduate studies for the field of regional science at Cornell. He teaches or taught methods of planning analysis and planning theory. Professor Donaghy received his PhD in regional science from Cornell University. And before returning to Cornell in 2007 as a full professor, he was professor of urban and regional planning at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His work has been supported by funding from the National Science Foundation, the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, the US Department of Education, and most recently, the United States Department of Defense. Author of numerous books and articles, I just want to say that I particularly appreciate your Oxford Handbook of Urban Economics and Planning, Kieran, that was published back in 2011. I still use it for my urban planning courses. He was executive director of the Regional Science Association International between 1997 and 2002. And oh, by the way, he was elected fellow of the Regional Science Association International in 2015. And I think we would consider it to be the equivalent of winning the Nobel Prize, Kieran, in our field of regional science. His talk today, titled Words Lost and Found, Regional Science Contribution in Support of Collective Decision-Making for Collective Action, is based on a chapter of the 2020 Handbook of Regional Science. Professor Kieran Donaghy, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Yuri. And can I share my screen?
You might have to give him
yeah, it says host disabled
host privileges. How?
Yeah, I just give the privilege. Yeah, I just make you as a co-hoster.
Okay. Very good. And let's do this. Okay. All right. And let me. All right. Let me say thank you very much for the invitation and opportunity to discuss some matters of great interest to me. Thanks in particular to Yuri for encouraging me and helping me to arrive at a topic. I want to apologize in advance for the verbosity of my slides. I decided to err on the side of explicitness. In the event that I've prepared too much material, I'll cut to the chase at the 45-minute mark. And I'll certainly share the slides with Yuri to share with others. And Yuri has a copy of the chapter from which this material has been taken. And so let me get underway. And as Yuri said, this material is from a chapter in the Handbook of Regional Science. And before we go any further, I'd like to distinguish between decision support systems and planning support systems. Decision support systems integrate subject-specific knowledge bases and analytical tools with inference engines to provide users with recommendations of decision sets and probable outcomes of decisions taken. Planning support systems, on the other hand, go further to indicate how decisions taken at one time or place are related to or condition other decisions taken at other times and places. And this is in keeping with Lou Hopkins's definition of a plan as the connecting thread between interdependent decisions. Well, since its beginning as an applied social science that focuses on socioeconomic problems in spatial contexts, regional science has had a close working relationship with regional or spatial planning in the public domain. John Friedman characterized regional planning as the management of change in territorially organized systems. Scholars who have identified as regional sciences have contributed much in the way of analytical frameworks to the contemporary spatial planners' toolbox. Their contributions include analytical frameworks for studying population growth and migration, measuring regional income and constructing social accounts, conducting economic impact analyses, characterizing flows of commodities and money, tracking regional business cycles, explaining industrial location and agglomeration economies, identifying potential industrial complexes, and understanding the transportation land use nexus and spatial interaction, among other things. These analytical frameworks have been employed pervasively in planning analyses over the last half century and have supported collective decision-making or design, which has led to collective action, which is the very point of planning in the public domain. Arguably, the challenges facing spatial planners and urban designers today have become more daunting than those confronted several generations ago. For now, the world in which planners and urban designers endeavor to manage change is violently conflicted, fraught with widening inequalities, in the throes of environmental crises and significant demographic changes, and presents the challenge of managing dwindling common resource pools while coping with growing populations. At the end of an industrial epoch, cities and regions must free themselves from legacies of outmoded technologies and infrastructure systems, rebuild the decaying built environment, and transition to more sustainable lifestyles. The world, moreover, is globalized, networked, and increasingly interdependent, and composed of inextricably intertwined complex adaptive systems. Both the seriousness and obviousness of our predicament have given rise to a new and busy area of scholarship in spatial planning called transition studies. These developments suggest that spatial planners and urban designers will continue to look to regional scientists to provide assistance to support decision-making, planning, and design. However, the complexity of the problems now confronting spatial planners puts in question whether many of the models and methods contributed by regional scientists in the past and based on strong simplifying assumptions are up to the task of providing adequate planning support. The abstract worlds of these models and methods are perhaps worlds well lost. There is a growing appreciation in planning and design fields that effective responses to today's urban and regional problems must reflect collective decision-making that leads to collective action. Collective decision-making, in turn, needs to be supported by analytical frameworks and processes that possess a number of critical features. These features include shared ontologies of planning environments, or an understanding of where working ontologies differ, realistic characterizations of behavior, and explicit characterizations of the endogenous determination of social structures, formal analyses of subjunctive reasoning processes, analyses of underlying causal mechanisms that can indicate where policy interventions are appropriate, and formal modeling of collective decision-making or design behavior to indicate what in the way of collective action is likely or feasible. Let me say a little bit to motivate this list of features. With respect to ontologies of planning environments, it is often necessary to be able to share assumptions about what there is or could be. That is to say, to compare ontologies. With respect to realistic characterizations of behavior, many planning scholars have come to appreciate that social behaviors are influenced by context, and that decisions in different domains of people's lives are not only interdependent, but also condition subsequent decisions in other domains through path-dependent relationships. Credible support of collective decisions needs to reflect these realities. With respect to subjunctive reasoning, much of planning and design work is of necessity based on what-if thinking that can be either prospective or retrospective. Structural support is needed to conduct, examine, and validate subjunctive reasoning in the analysis of policies. As for causal analysis, to manage change effectively, planning practitioners need to understand realistically what causal mechanisms are at work, in addition to what the concerns of stakeholders may be, and what the nature of human behavior and the limits of our capabilities to manage our own affairs are. As for formal modeling of collective decision-making, often information about values, resources, and dispositions of different actors interested in actions is available and can, with appropriate modeling frameworks, be used to anticipate how the relationships between actors may evolve so as to identify possible or likely outcomes and indicate along what lines collective action may be feasible. In this talk, I present a survey of contributions made by regional scientists in recent decades that provide capacity to spatial planners and urban designers to engage in collective decision-making, leading to collective action by bringing into view relevant aspects of the world, both as it is and as it could be. The plan of the talk is as follows, and you can see we've already concluded the introduction. The next 7 sections correspond to those features that I've just tried to motivate, and then there's a brief conclusion. So, what's an ontology? An ontology is simply an accounting of what there is, or as other philosophers put it, the furniture of the world. Comes from the Greek word ontos for being and logi or knowledge of. A social ontology is an accounting of such artifacts as conventions or rule-based practices, social innovations and institutions, norms, rights and obligations, intentions, designs, and yes, plans. The philosopher John Searle refers to these as social facts. Of course, in planning, one also needs to account for non-social things, the natural and built environments, which condition our plan making and plan using and other behaviors and our interactions with them. As propedeutic to laying out the elements of a planning support system that can be used to explore whether and to what extent urban development plans made by different agents or different communities are compatible and can be used by those other than who made the plans to coordinate action, Lou Hopkins, Nikhil Kaza, and Varkey George Palathucheril in 2005 in an article in Environment and Planning B elaborated a planning data model. And they had this particular graphic, which I think illustrates nicely the relationship between the actors, the activities, the assets, and the actions, and how plans mediate what's going on there. Let me say a bit about what's going on in this picture. Objects that exist in this model can be categorized as assets, actors, activities, and actions, which Nikhil Kaza in his 2007 dissertation later termed the 4 A's of planning. The figure we just saw depicts relationships among entities representing the world, entities representing changes in that world, and entities representing plans. The entire system depicted in the figure may be viewed as a state of the world. In this state, actors comprise persons, organizations, and populations. Assets include buildings, networks, and areas designated for particular uses, so presumably the natural and built environments. Activities are practices in which actors engage, such as residing in a particular location, producing goods and services, consuming, or trip making. Activities are enabled by and conducted in, on, or with assets. Capabilities is an expansive category of entity that takes in characteristics of individuals, such as preferences, skills, or financial capabilities. This maps nicely onto some of the work that Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum have done on the capabilities approach of human development. It also takes in attributes individuals possess by virtue of their relationships to others, that is to say, their social capital, such as rights, responsibilities, authorities, and behavioral norms. Actions are what change assets and capabilities. In the situations these three authors consider, plans are primarily about investments, changing assets, and changing capabilities. Actors make plans, perceive particular issues, make proposals for action, and have authority and influence in decision situations. In decision situations, actors use plans, confront issues and alternatives, and make decisions for action. In providing this robust and well-populated ontology just sketched, which Nikhil Kaza further refined and mapped into a semantics that can be marked up in a standardized language to use in examining and comparing the contents of alternative plans, many of which corresponded to communities in Northern Illinois, the authors have proceeded phenomenologically. That is to say, they have described from within planning practice a state of the world that is recognizable by planning practitioners, developers, public utilities directors, firms, residents, and other stakeholders or officials. To meet their objective of developing a planning data model, they had no need to render more exotic what they are describing in the technical languages of a social science or philosophy, or to probe more deeply into the nature of the objects. And indeed, the ontology they have provided will support scholarly conversations about relationships in the states of the world their model can describe. If, however, we ask questions other than those motivating Hopkins and company, especially questions about how we go about the business of managing transitions in, say, interdependent infrastructure systems that feature in the capital plans of multiple jurisdictions, so as to achieve more sustainable lifestyles, we will want to investigate further the objects of this world and the relationships between them. In so doing, we will inquire after the behavior of actors and causal relationships. Hence, we may find further philosophical probing and scientific inquiry useful. Now, Hopkins, Kaza, and George Palathuchil are non-committal about what models of rational behavior should inform a planning data model or a planning support system. But if we are to bring actual human capabilities, limitations, and relationships, and social capital and networks more sharply into focus, it's perhaps better to introduce a more complex caricature of human behavior than is provided by so-called Homo economicus, with his or her instrumental reasoning solely in the service of self-interest. Amartya Sen has characterized Homo economicus as a rational fool. Behavioral economists Donaghy and Shaw suggest the following principles as candidates for informing economic and other reasoning when engaged in planning or policy analysis. First, other people's behavior matters. People do many things by observing others and copying. People are encouraged to continue to do things when they feel other people approve of their habits or their behavior. Habits are important. People do many things without consciously thinking about them. These habits are hard to change. People are motivated to do the right thing. There are cases where money is demotivating as it undermines people's intrinsic motivation. Fourth, people's self-expectations influence how they behave. They want their actions to be in line with their values and commitments. Fifth, people are loss averse. It's the old one in the hand is worth two in the bush, and they hang on to what they consider theirs. Sixth, people are bad at computation when making decisions. They put undue weight on recent events and too little on far off ones. They cannot calculate probabilities well, and they worry too much about unlikely events, and they are strongly influenced by how problem information is presented to them. 7, people need to feel involved and effective to make a change. Just giving people the incentives and the information is not necessarily enough. Daniel Kahneman, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, has challenged fundamentally our notions of rationality and has shown how we are, in fact, oblivious to many of our own cognitive abilities. Complexity theory, of which Yuri Mansouri is an expert, has raised profound questions about how we understand social behavior and aggregate effects and how we view urban phenomena. This branch of theory has also given rise to new approaches to computer-based learning about complex adaptive systems, which make intensive use of agent-based models. Findings of complexity theory have stood on its head some prevailing criticism of recent decades. For example, macroeconomists of the representative agent school have criticized Keynesians for using models that lack micro foundations. That is to say, the model's equations cannot be derived from a representative agent's application problem. But a major point of the study of complex adaptive systems is that emergent phenomena simply do not have micro foundations. Behavioral phenomena at higher scales, like traffic congestion or climate change or pollution or the tragedy of the commons, are qualitatively different from behaviors aggregated up from lower scales. Empirical methods have not fallen behind these theoretical developments. Yanis Ioannidis' path-breaking volume, From Neighborhoods to Nations, The Economics of Social Interaction, collects important results from literatures on the economics of non-market-based social interactions, geoinformatics, and spatial econometrics to demonstrate how social constructs of contemporary society, such as evolving neighborhood effects, can be observed, modeled, and have hypotheses about them confronted empirically. Significant developments in the study and operationalization of social capital and social networks have also been made. Excuse me just a second here. Ioannidis uses the conventions of graph theory or network theory to develop a dynamic model of individual decision-making in which the individual is influenced by actions of others nearby. His model can accommodate a broad range of instances of social interactions, including consumption activities, human capital accumulation, and income-generating activities that may be subject to neighborhood and peer effects. Consider as an example, disregarding notational definitions, the utility function for an individual that features in one of Ioannidis' models. Ioannidis assumes that individual I, at time t, enjoys socializing with other individuals with specific characteristics. He conveys this assumption through an expression for I's taste for the average characteristics of his or her neighbors, which he calls a level local contextual effect. The marginal utility of one's own activity also depends on one's own neighbor's mean characteristics in this case, and Ioannidis refers to this as the marginal local contextual effect, and separately on one's own characteristics. Turning first to interactions that are symmetric, an individual I at time t can be affected by his or her neighbor's actions in two ways. One way may be thought of as conformism. Individual I suffers disutility from a gap between his or her own current action and the mean action of his or her neighbors in the previous period. This is often referred to as keeping up with the Joneses. Ioannidis observes that this formulation allows the affected neighbor's actions to depend on individual socioeconomic characteristics. It expresses effects of endogenous local interaction. If an adjacency matrix in a social network model allows for loops, where feedbacks of one's actions return to oneself, one can introduce own conformity or a habit formation effect, such as when one dislikes changing one's own actions from period to period. Remember, habits are hard to break. Ioannidis also allows for a global conformity effect by modeling the gap between an individual's current action and the mean action among all the individuals in the previous period. This gap is intended to capture endogenous global interactions, although with a time lag. Ioannidis also assumes that an individual I incurs a utility cost for maintaining his or her connection with another individual J at time T, which is a function of the intensity of the social attachment or the synergistic effect. So this is the cost of keeping up with your friends, the time that you expend, which could be expended on something else. Finally, Ioannidis allows for an individual's own marginal utility to include a stochastic shock representing unanticipated developments in space and time. Pulling together all these effects in a quadratic expression, Ioannidis obtains a utility function that can be used to model decision-making of individuals that is influenced by considerations of neighbors' actions. And I would refer you to my chapter or to his book for more details. And here's what that expression looks like. You can see the level local contextual effect, the marginal utility of own characteristics, the marginal local contextual effect, the global conformity effect, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's a very complicated utility function indeed. Let's see, let's let this person in, okay. So while Ioannidis and others have shown us how to model and test theories about complex social interactions and their effects, as regional scientists working in the service of planners and designers, we would also like to pursue realistic comparative dynamics, dynamic analyses, and assess the validity of our thought experimentation, some of which concerns possible worlds. Remember, in a comparative statics analysis, something has changed once and for all. When we close the curtain, we open it up again and all the changes are in place. In a comparative dynamics analysis, we're studying the evolution of different paths of a system. Now, the subject of possible worlds has to do with the truth of counterfactual statements about alternative futures, but that could also be the truth about alternative pasts and presents. Possible world analysis is also about the validity of logical inferences about possible worlds. Possible worlds are defined as maximally possible states of affairs, whereas a state of affairs is a relationship that either holds or doesn't. Alternative states of the world that can be entertained within the planning data model of Hopkins, Kaza, and George Palathucherel are also states of affairs. Okay, my computer has frozen. Let me see if I can. Here we go. Okay. The question of possible worlds, not just alternative futures, arises in the context of transitions. We want to know about not only the status of future states of affairs in plans in the sense of feasibility or compatibility with other states of affairs, but also how sound our reasoning about them is. This comes up in the context of public meetings about plans for transition all the time. I would like to argue that to make progress in answering this question, we need two developments. We need a planning support system that would enable stakeholders to play out sequences of decisions which are related to other decisions made by themselves and other stakeholders, and to observe the systemic implications of these decisions, enabling them to learn how easy or difficult it may be to achieve some intended transition, how reachable some desired social state of affairs may be. Secondly, we need a dynamic truth functional modal logic engine to establish the truth values of propositions about future states of affairs and transition paths to them. Now, regarding the first development, it is evident that some decisions' outcomes are contingent upon others, and that path dependence plays a critical role in conditioning what states of affairs can be realized. This is trivially obvious to any land use planner or developer in the context of a neighborhood development. But it also becomes obvious when one adopts a higher, broader, and longer-term perspective of the evolution of regional systems. For example, a region afflicted with what's termed Dutch disease, or the so-called resource curse, like Appalachia, where instead of developing an industrial base, they simply mine the coal. Budget constraints and other political realities, such as the lack of political will, conflicting values, legislative gridlock, etc., also constrain what can be done, say within a budget cycle, leading many to conclude, we just can't get there from here. Moreover, it's not uncommon for actors who have set upon some course of actions to not follow through, not just for reasons of acrasia or weakness of the will. Time inconsistent policies may make perfect sense from the perspective of some participants, for example, the leaders in a dynamic leader-follower game. Regarding the second development, we are interested in determining and often challenging the truth values of propositions about what would happen under different plans in alternative futures. Strong claims are advanced every day by parties interested in the advancement of pet projects. For example, gas companies wishing to drill in rural areas of the southern tier of New York State, companies with stakes in the Keystone Pipeline from Canada to southern US ports, or proponents and opponents of genetically modified crops. We raise, entertain, and challenge claims not only about the feasibility, safety, and systemic implications of states of affairs, but also about the validity of the reasoning and arguing for them. We would like to check both types of claims in what the philosopher Robert Brandom has called the scorekeeping of our normative pragmatics, our speech acts. Some logicians, such as Quine, that we referred to earlier, have been skeptical about the introduction of modological operators in our assessment of the truth of modal statements. Much of the controversy about possible worlds has had to do with argumentation about counterfactual suppositions. An example is the question of what might have been the role of the United States military in the Southeast Asian conflict of the 1960s and 70s if the Gulf of Tonkin incident had not been staged. One might also ask the same thing, what if the United States had practiced a more friendly foreign relation with Ukraine 20 years ago instead of the result that's happened today? Clearly, we are interested in asking questions about both alternative futures, past and present, and possible worlds, even if some believe such questions defy determinative answers. So I'd like to consider subjunctive reasoning in policy analysis briefly here. In 1985, Walter Izard and Blaine Lewis wrote a paper entitled James P. Bennett on Subjunctive Reasoning, Policy Analysis, and Political Argument. As the paper's title suggests, Izard and Lewis were digesting ideas from a much longer but unpublished work by Bennett on how subjunctive reasoning is deployed in political argumentation, especially policy analysis. The policy question that Bennett used to illustrate his points was no first use of nuclear weapons by the United States, and the different arguments about this policy advanced by different experts. The debate took place in both Foreign Affairs and in Scientific American. Among the key points made by Bennett and underscored by Izard and Lewis, the following. In doing policy analysis, we must conduct subjunctive reasoning, which is defined to be reasoning about counterfactual situations or things that might have been true under different conditions. It embraces what-if thinking. Subjunctive reasoning is unavoidable. Secondly, formal logic provides little support for describing how political argument, based as it must be on subjunctive reasoning, is conducted, or for normatively guiding how it should be done. Now, one type of logic related to possible world semantics is suggestive for both descriptive and normative applications. But this type of logic typically ignores the central feature of policy prescription, which is the construction and evaluative probing of the internal structure of possible worlds and the courses of action by which they may be reached or accessed. Fourth point they make is that some of the best examples of policy advocacy make liberal use of or refer to external textual materials such as histories, stories, and myths, that is to say, narratives. And finally, when policy advocates make, or fifth, when policy advocates make explicit assertions, they rely upon pragmatic and syntactic presuppositions that they make. That is to say, they're relying upon the context of speech patterns, and they anticipate their readers will make these as well to establish coherence of their arguments and to refer to external materials. 6, features 2 through 4 suggest that adequate representation of subjunctive reasoning in arguments must utilize an approach to possible worlds that is constructivist, shows in detail the realistic or substantively meaningful steps or ways by which one transitions from the present world to another. B, extended types of textually oriented data, which are simply not numbers. And C, a significantly enriched model or argument in which formal analysis is applied to the relevant quantitative and qualitative data after implicit assumptions, cause-effect relationships, and implicit action output processes have been stated and supported. The 7th feature is the careful study of how policy advocacy is accomplished under conventional criteria is necessary to develop an adequate language for modeling political argument. The need for establishing higher standards for counterfactual analyses of regional problems and appropriate policy responses has become increasingly apparent as criticisms of integrated assessments of impacts of climate change, increasing social and economic inequality, expanding regional political, military, and refugee crises, and the unwinding of globalization, among other problems, have mounted. Izard and Lewis, after Bennett, identify strengths, but also limitations of possible worlds, semantics in such cases when pursued without adequate institutional context. Alternatively, counterfactual analyses based on extrapolations from historical institutional content alone raise questions about the validity of the inferences drawn. What we want to know is not only the status of future states of affairs and policies and plans in the sense of feasibility or compatibility with other states of affairs, but also how sound our reasoning about them is. Clearly, it would seem we need to work simultaneously within what Willifred Sellers referred to as the space of causes as the space of reasons. So we turn to causal analysis. Now, certainly the analysis of causal mechanisms at work in the physical and social worlds will be critical to determining what types of collective action are appropriate to take in responding to socioeconomic problems in spatial contexts. One of the world's most highly regarded philosophers of science writing about causality and counterfactuals is Nancy Cartwright. She's both a realist and a particularist. About causation, Cartwright writes, there's great variety of different kinds of causes, and even causes of the same kind can operate in different ways. Hence, the term cause is highly unspecific. Its use commits us to nothing about the kind of causality involved, nor about how the causes operate. Recognizing this should make us more cautious about investing in the quest for universal methods for causal inference. This is the particularist flavor of her argument. In her book, Hunting Causes and Using Them, she examines closely the accounts of general laws or regularities that are dominant today. And these include probabilistic theories of causality and consequent Bayes-Netz methods of causal inference or analyses based on Granger causality, modularity accounts, invariance accounts, natural experiments accounts, causal process theories, and efficacy accounts. While each of these approaches has something even much to recommend it, she argues that each of them faces difficulties that prevent them from being accepted as a universal approach. Cartwright argues instead for thick causal concepts, for thick causal concepts relevant to particular situations. So rich with detail about the specific situation. And since the word cause, while essentially meaning to bring about some kind of effect, has so many instantiations and substitute terms, she argues for formalization of particular causal arguments that are important for rigorous analysis, case-specific approaches. She further argues that many counterfactual analyses conducted in economics or the social sciences more broadly today do not provide genuine answers to what if questions about policies, especially the practice of randomized controlled trials. They provide instead tools for measuring causal contributions in very specific types of situations. Galilean experiments, she calls them, in which only one factor or perhaps a few may be changed against a ceteris paribus background. The upshot of her argument is that we may, even must, use sophisticated analytical tools, but we must be savvy about context and causal relations of specific states of affairs we study. The London School of Economics economist Jochen Rund goes further to argue against the search for Law-like causal regularities in economics, and by extension in planning and regional science, and in support identifying causal mechanisms that bring about particular events or particular classes of events. Rund recognizes that establishing a credible account of causality relative to a specific audience is a social accomplishment realized within a discipline through fair comparison of competing explanations. It is not an outcome that can be achieved algorithmically. An example of causal and counterfactual analysis in a planning support system is provided by the work of Brian Deal and his colleagues at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in a paper that they published in a computer-based journal. The authors argue that planning support system-based scenario planning processes and outcomes might be improved by including multi-directional temporal analyses, because methods of such analysis enable users to see more deeply into the potential consequences of scenarios considered. They demonstrate the benefits of multi-directional temporal analysis with comparisons of actual and simulated population development patterns that they obtained under different scenarios examined in simulations for McHenry County using the LEAM planning support system, which embodies a very large spatial dynamic cellular automata model. LEAM stands for Land Use Evolution Assessment Model, I believe. They consider 4 types of temporal analysis: forecasting, backcasting, recasting, and past casting. And I guess you would be familiar with what forecasting is, and backcasting is the reverse of forecasting. Recasting is a reconstruction of the present and uses forecasting techniques that start from a condition set in the past and project to the current state, usually for purposes of comparison. This type of analysis is useful for calibration purposes and understanding previously unforeseen condition that emerges in the present state. Past casting, another novel term, starts from a current time point and draws a developmental path back to a previous point in time for the purpose of understanding the processes that took place or should have taken place in order to arrive at the current or virtual state. And these are illustrated in the following graphics, which I don't have time to explain in length, but I would urge you to look at the chapter or look at these slides more closely when you get the opportunity. Now, as with any type of thought experimentation, the issue of validation of planning support system generated experimental findings must be addressed. The authors note that adopting multiple temporal perspectives may help us to identify what may be missing from a model and suggest that usefulness of scenario analyses trumps accuracy in the case of planning. but they do not address the issue of thought experiment validation head on. And this is not a criticism of their work, since they don't set out to accomplish that. We should note, however, that even accurate forecasts or pastcasts may not validate the findings of a thought experiment if the planning support system employed does not embody a reasonable characterization of the causal mechanisms that are bringing about the developments of interest. Whether or not one has the right causal mechanisms in a model to support planning analyses or alternative development paths must be argued for on grounds other than forecast accuracy. And it will be difficult to clinch the case for multidirectional temporal analysis on the grounds of usefulness alone. If we wish to use a planning support system to explore instructively deviations from a path of development, whether prior, current, or future, we also need to be able to say which model deviations are plausible, which statements about possible states of affairs are true. Recent developments in dynamic modal logic would appear to be available to help us assess arguments were we able to code them into the right analytical engine. There's been a lot of work on this done recently. One paper by Galliani is important. The last substantive subject I'd like to talk about, if I have a few more minutes, is modeling collective decision-making behavior and design behavior. And I understand Michael Batty spoke to you earlier. You were very lucky to have that great presenter to hold forth. Much of his recent book, The New Science of Cities, is intended to convey what has been accomplished over the last few decades in modeling complex adaptive systems behavior over hierarchical urban networks and illustrating how tools for modeling such behaviors can be incorporated into decision support or planning support systems. In chapter 12 of the third part of this book, however, Batty discusses how modeling the design of urban systems by different agents can be used to support creation and analysis of plans and policies for communities. He's concerned with design and decision-making as processes of resolving conflict or reaching consensus when relevant stakeholders that will enable collective action to be taken. To model the evolution of relationships between actors that can lead to collective action, he draws on conceptual and mathematical tools first introduced by the sociologist James Coleman. And Coleman's theory of collective action is based on a set of assumptions relating actors to factors, resources, and interests. And while I can't go into the details here, Batty presents a useful diagram of the interaction involved. I would urge you to take a look at that chapter of his book, which is fascinating about identifying feasible outcomes where there are contested issues in a community. Batty elaborates how a formal characterization of the relationships at the core of Coleman's theory can be developed using Markov chains and how the equilibrium to which the model converges is suggestive of a course of collective action. And he provides illustrations of applications of this approach to modeling inner-city poverty and resource allocation in a local authority. If pursued further, this work would seem to have great potential for identifying promising formulations of projects around which support may converge. To conclude, in this talk, I have presented a survey of analytical contributions made by regional scientists in recent decades that provide capacity to spatial planners and urban designers to engage in collective decision-making, leading to collective action by bringing into view relevant aspects of the world as it is and as it could be. I began by identifying critical features of analytical frameworks supporting collective decision-making for collective action. I offered an argument for why we need a more complete ontology than what has traditionally been invoked in spatial planning, and discussed the sophisticated applied ontology in the planning data model of Hopkins et al. Noting that this ontology is non-committal on underlying social behavior, I further discussed contributions from behavioral economics that might be integrated into Hopkins et al.'s framework, and I illustrated from the work of Ioannidis how determination of social structure in space can be endogenized. While acknowledging that the framework of Hopkins et al. Supports analyses of transition paths to alternative futures, I argued for formalizing analyses of subjunctive reasoning, drawing on an important but neglected contribution by Izard and Lewis. I then proceeded to a discussion of causal analysis in general and considered an example of how such an analysis can be conducted in the planning support system of Deal and All. In the talk's final substantive section, I briefly considered how Batty is modeling collective decision-making in urban design. On a personal note, I should note that much of my motivation for focusing on the set of issues considered in this talk derives from my involvement in a study group seeking to understand how a transition to a more sustainable energy system on a regional scale in the northeastern United States can be facilitated. Transitions of this sort, which are societal in scope and ring changes through industries and communities, cannot be imposed from above. That is to say, cannot be socially engineered. If behavioral economists and political scientists are right, such transitions must be brought into being by the collective action of multiple governments at multiple levels. Agencies, firms, utilities, households, environmentalists, that is to say, many stakeholders. My intuition is that the planning work associated with facilitating historic changes of this sort that need to happen can be enabled by planning support systems and planning data models that can be employed to explore the compatibility of different plans as designs and strategies and explore the reachability of certain states of affairs in communities and regions. Thank you very much for your attention. I apologize for the overrun, and I'd be happy to listen to any comments you might want to offer or answer any questions you would address to me. I will stop sharing my screen so I can see you all.
You time it perfectly, Kieran. You know, just like the legendary planner you are. My plan is to first give my feedback and then open up the floor for discussion here. And I'm aware that we have 5 minutes left before the 1:40 mark. So I'm definitely not a critique of your work. We have always been the same team. Nevertheless, I want to help some of my students here in my urban planning analysis class to navigate our way through this very thoughtful and deep philosophical approach to collective decision making. So if I may make an observation, is that we now live in a very divisive time, in recent history, if not ever. So my question is, how do some of these advances in digital sciences and in the sciences more generally can help us, come up with a better design of policies? I think collective decision doesn't necessarily mean a consensus, but it will still be a challenge when we are in a time at a time where many people are guided more by politics of the day, more so than the facts. Yeah, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, I think clearly that we live in a very challenged time. We live in an era of tribalism, and where people resolve cognitive conflicts in favor of their most deeply held beliefs or ideological commitments. But I think what the contributions that I've been discussing here show us is that it's possible to bring into alignment different plans for development or growth or preservation of the environment or producing greater resilience and sustainability between different communities by, I think, the work that Nikhil Kaza has done in developing his markup system for making different plans from communities or regions talk to each other, and then finding what the minimal changes are necessary to bring them into alignment so that you can get a collective action undertaken. That's one thing. I think the work by Michael Batty, in particular, using James Coleman's models in a Markov chain context, also is able to provide with us a probabilistic forecast of what kinds of results would be feasible and what kinds of outcomes would be achievable. It's one thing for engineers to draw up a plan and to solve an optimization problem. It's another thing to get acceptance, commitment. One of the biggest challenges we face, I think, in bringing alternative sources of energy online and incorporating them into the grid is being able to demonstrate to people that there is another way of doing things. People tend to be habituated to, and can only envision one way, but you have to show them the dance steps. How do we get from point A to point B? What are the likely implications going to be? How are we going to put in place some hold harmless conditions so that the most vulnerable people will be protected in the enormous changes that we have to make over the next decades?
Thank you. With that, I would like to invite the audience for their reaction in the form of questions or comments. You may speak directly to the microphone. I will also monitor the chat, or you can raise your thumbs up as well.
You have that recorded.
Yes, I do.
Hello. Yeah, I have a quick question.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Maybe not so quick, but early on in the talk, you mentioned about projecting future analyses as a function of time. And I see changes occur both continuously and discontinuously, where there's massive shifts in opinion, things like that. How do you adjust for both of them, or how do you make sure that your model includes both those large scale seismic shifts and the continuous gradual changes? How do you account for that?
Well, I think, both are happening. And I think chaos theory has certainly shown us in some of the topological modeling that was done in the 1970s, et cetera, which that when you passed a certain point, certain enormous changes could happen, and you could incrementally approach that point. And I think some of these mathematical tools have been applied to political systems. There was a very interesting piece recently on one of the last nights of the French Revolution, where Robespierre went from leading the revolution to losing his head. So that's going on. There's been a lot of very good work now done in looking not just at deviations from equilibrium growth paths, say, but global stability issues and different types of chaoticity by estimating models that have the appropriate dynamics and nonlinearities, and then looking at the so-called Lyapunov characteristic exponents. And what can be done, I've actually done some work on this myself, is you can take partial derivatives of the Lyapunov characteristic exponents with respect to critical policy parameters and find out what the range is of that parameter's value in which you would have a stable system and where you would have a system where all the wheels come off. So, I mean, we have the tools. It's not a question of tools as much as having a deeply enough appreciation of what's going on there to match the appropriate modeling framework with the situation so that we capture both the incremental continuous changes and the sudden disruptions. But it's a good point. I mean, this is what's going on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I can kind of see how you can do that modeling and mixing and matching after the fact, once you've already seen something to match past trends. But how do you do that for future predictions?
That's tough. That's crystal ball gazing, probably. I mean, we in some of the work that Brian Deal and his colleagues are doing with their planning support system, they're trying to look at possible land use changes in the upper Midwest. and to explore different development paths, knowing what they know about development dynamics, from having studied quite a few around the country. And that's part of what it's about, is to be able to anticipate where sudden changes will occur. But predicting, it's not a science. It's something, it's crystal ball gazing or what have you. I mean, you can forecast based on the statistical properties of a system, but being able to really say what lies around the bend is, it's challenging. There is a very sophisticated journal, the Journal of Technological Forecasting, which is, I believe, published by Haifa University in Israel. And it has some of the most sophisticated work on some of these questions. But again, it's very hard to find some generalized rules. It's really context dependent. It's the history, the narrative structure that underlies something. What people believe about something is as important as what is actually the case. And so it's important to have both the psychological, the behavioral, as well as the systems effects that are based on hard natural conditions in a model, depending on what you're looking at. But for these bigger societal changes, the integrated assessment modeling work has come under a great deal of criticism because of how ham-fisted different pieces of these modeling structures are. They're essentially assembled so that they will get a solution, not necessarily show us what will happen, which is one of the reasons why many people are skeptical about what these models show us.
Well, thank you very much. This was a really cool talk. I don't know if that's appropriate to say, but I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Jeff. Hao has a question as well. Hao, go ahead.
Yeah, great. And thank you for your great talk. So I just wondering, the good question is, how did you see the technology, the current technology development or advancement to help the subjective reasoning determine the decision making process, collective decision maker process?
Well, what we're really talking about here in the subjunctive reasoning piece is exploring multiple chains of inference to see to what extent we can draw valid inferences under sets of conditions. The people who explore possible worlds applications, and this is often done in military colleges and research tanks and things of that sort, where people are looking at very minor changes. People right now in the Biden administration are saying, if 20 years ago we didn't, if we helped Ukraine to become better integrated with the European Union, we wouldn't find ourselves in the situation we are today. And people are looking at that very closely because they want to learn lessons. Given that Ukraine situation is very unique, very different, nonetheless, they're trying to say, how can we be sure that the lessons we're drawing are valid inferences? How can we develop the right inference engines to work with a cluster of assumptions that we change one by one, or a little bit here and a little bit there, and then see how the outcome changes. So I would refer you to the paper by Galliani that I cited in my presentation here, but which is in the full citation is given in the references to my paper. And go to that journal, because he's looking at issues, he's looking at arguments about climate change. And that's what his contribution is how do we impose the best dynamic modal logic inference engines on some of these very thorny issues to tease out as much as we possibly can that's humanly possible. I don't know if I've answered your question or not, but like in many fields, it's very specialized. And I took a fair amount of logic courses in college, and it's over my head too. So I read it as an amateur and as somebody who's interested in it, but not someone, and I recognize the importance of getting it right. But I am not somebody who does it myself. And that's why I can't really give you a better informed answer.
Thank you.
Let me follow up on that actually, and take everyone here to a ground zero in our fight against global warming. So look at the CMAP, which is a Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, onto 2050 plan. One of the actions proposed for sustainability is raising, gasoline taxes, which obviously is not going to happen now with gas at $5 per gallon. But when we go back to normal, how do we use some of these models, to get people to our side and understand that climate change is really happening, and how do we encourage people to, use less fossil fuel and make the shift towards more of the green kind of technology?
I don't know that you're going to do it with a model. You may. A number of years ago, I worked. We may have been together at Cornell at the same time. I worked with Mark Turnquist on a model of introducing hydrogen fuel vehicles in Hawaii. So to reduce the amount of petroleum fuels that would have to be imported to Hawaii for internal combustion engines. And it was research funded by General Motors, because they wanted to know, should they go ahead with the development of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, would it work economically in Hawaii? And we built a computable general equilibrium model. Javier Perez worked on it with me. And we, got some very, not definitive results. We got some numbers that resulted. But I think demonstration projects are the answer there. I think in many parts of the world, I was talking to Bob Balder at AAP NYC the other day, and he was saying how green or blue hydrogen projects are really blossoming all over the New York metropolitan area. And I think it's demonstrating the viability of that. I mean, most big shipping companies recognize that electric trucks is a non-issue, because the batteries would be too heavy and would require too much charging, whereas hydrogen fuel cell vehicles are really what makes sense for ships and for heavy freight vehicles, for trucks. And so I think it's the maturation of some of these technologies that's bringing costs down. It's showing that they can work. It's showing people that they can maintain a comfortable lifestyle without being tied to these habits, which we know are putting the world in a very seriously dangerous state. Today, I don't know if you heard it, 3 houses down the street from me, somebody's having a geothermal well dug so that they can have geothermal power in their house. And the woman who's having it done is an associate dean in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Cornell. And she said, I will never recoup the cost of this expenditure of having this geothermal well dug. But I'm doing it for ethical reasons. I'm doing it to show people in my neighborhood that it's possible to get off the grid. It's possible to get off natural gas. It's possible to not use fossil fuels. She drives a Prius and she's doing everything green, so to speak. But it's a statement. The more and more people have projects that demonstrate the viability of alternative technologies and ways of living that are people-friendly, community-friendly, earth-friendly, the better.
Thank you so much. I want to make sure that I have the opportunity to thank you, Kieran, for being so generous with your time and for the very excellent presentations. You know, everyone, please join me in giving Professor Kieran Donaghy a big round of applause.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure. And I will send Yuri my slides. And you have the paper, right, Yuri? So you can make that.
I do, yes.
Yeah, okay.
More than happy to circulate that.
All right. Thank you all for listening.
And thank you for coming today.
My pleasure. Good to see you, Suti.
Thank you very much. Good to see you. Have a good day, Professor.
All right.
What time is it in Thailand?
Is this 3 a.m. in the morning?
Yeah,
Oh, my
hardcore.
goodness. That's dedication. All right.
Okay.
Take care.
Jeff here
Very nice to
is
see you.
our chair of the department, Kieran. Yes.
Nice
Well,
to
you
meet you.
You must have a good department.
It's very good. I'm very happy with all of them.
Excellent. All right. All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Keep safe.
Bye. Good day.